Hello and welcome to our Bible study. My name's Geoffrey and I'm minister of Putney Methodist Church in southwest London, and it's good to be with you again. I do hope this finds you as well as possible, especially on this, the first day of our second lockdown here in England. This video is to introduce the topic for our second Bible study on Sunday night. The details of how to join that Bible study are all below us here, I hope, and on our website at the church. And this video aims to provide a bit of background to the reading I've chosen and to allow us to plunge straight into questions and discussion on Sunday night. The passage I've chosen is another very famous one. Last week we were in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, and this week we're with Moses in the desert and the burning bush. And the theme of our Bible studies this month is God with us. God with us. And I chose this passage because it speaks very clearly of the experience of God being with his people. And it has provoked lots of Christians to reflect over the years about how God manifests God's self, how we feel God present with us, how God reveals God's self to God's people, and how we might encounter God. And it also says quite some foundational things about God and God's desire for a relationship with the people God has made. So, like last week, I'd emphasised that our Bible studies are for everybody of all levels. So I'm going to go right from the beginning, from the basics. And if you know everything I'm about to say, then please don't worry. And I'm sure you'll bring lots of things with you to the study. So we're in the Old Testament. We're at the beginning of our Bibles in the book of Exodus, which is the second book of the Bible and the second of the 5 books that Christians call the Pentateuch. Pentateuchos from the Greek, meaning 5 scrolls. And these are the 5 books that begin the Bible. Jews would call the same books the Torah, which can be translated law, but perhaps is better understood as guidance or commandments or instruction. And the Bible starts with Genesis, where we were last week, and we have that introduction with lots of the exciting stories like Adam and Eve and Noah and all the rest of it. Then it goes into the story of Abraham and God revealing himself to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And at the end of Genesis, we have some of the most famous stories in the Old Testament, the stories around Joseph and his coat. And you may know, either from the Bible or from the musical, that Joseph ends up in Egypt. And so eventually do all his brothers and all the families and all the Israelite people. And Genesis ends on a happy note because the Israelites have found food and a place to live and comfort and security. All well and good. However, Exodus begins a few hundred years later and everything has gone wrong. The Israelites are now numerous people, and the Egyptians have become anxious and nervous and worried about them and fearful of them, and so they have enslaved them, and they are using them as forced labour effectively. And things have got so bad, in fact, that Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, has decided to kill all male offspring of the Hebrews. And Moses is born into that at the beginning of the passage I've chosen at chapter 2. So we begin then with chapter 2. And chapter 2, we're not going to really talk about that much unless you would like to, but they provide the context for what's coming in chapter 3. So Moses escapes death as an infant through the cleverness of his mother and his aunt, and is adopted by a daughter of Pharaoh. And he becomes a prince of Egypt, and some of you will know the cartoon and now the musical on that subject. But Moses seems to suffer an identity crisis. He is conscious that he's an Israelite, and so he seeks to show solidarity with the oppressed Israelites, and he murders one of their overseers who's beating them. But then he is rejected by his own people when he tries to stop a fight between 2 Israelites who then turn on him and say, well, who are you to lord it over us? And Moses, who's afraid of his life because of what he's done, because of the murder he has committed, flees off to Midian. Now, one of the things we often struggle with in the Old Testament is the names of places, because it's not always completely clear what place they're referring to, and places change their names over time. But we think that Midian, and hopefully you can see the map here on my right, is modern Sinai and over into what is now Saudi Arabia. So this rather barren, not particularly hospitable place. So he flees from civilization, we might say. And there he encounters Rubel, the priest, and her daughters, who are, he's a priest, but they're also farmers. And he marries one of the daughters and gets a job looking after Rubel's flocks. And it's interesting to speculate on what's going on in Moses' life there. Is he quite pleased to be away from metropolitan Egypt and all that represents, and the palace? Is he does he regard it as some sort of career break, or is he deeply resentful and bitter and upset to be stuck out in this wild place? But that's speculation. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, things are getting worse for the Israelites, and God has taken pity on them. And clearly, God is looking for somebody to help deliver them from their slavery. Moses then goes out into the wilderness, or beyond the wilderness. And we always have to remember that the words we are reading here have been translated from another language, in this case Hebrew. And we have got excellent translations, and we don't need to go away and learn Hebrew unless we'd really like to. But sometimes we can struggle to understand what's going on because we cannot quite get the nuance of the meaning. And one Hebrew scholar I heard talking about this passage explained that in Hebrew there are different words for wilderness. Just as we in Britain have different words for the kind of rain we experience, and people, the indigenous people of North America and the Arctic regions have different words for snow because they experience so much of it. And so in Hebrew there are different types of wilderness because there are lots of different kinds of desert places. Some are and the words here are that there is normal wilderness, perhaps that you get near a town you could get something from, and then there was real wilderness where there was absolutely nobody. And here Moses has gone beyond the wilderness to a really lonely desert place where when we might be able to imagine, or perhaps we visited somewhere like that, completely devoid of people and very sparse plant life. And we might like to think on Sunday night about how in the Bible, when we think about God revealing himself to his people, often it happens in desert places. And he goes to Mount Horeb, and this is another of those places where we're not completely sure what's meant. We think, most commentators think, Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai, which is at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula, and which many Christians regularly visit on pilgrimages. And there God appears to Moses in a burning bush, a bush that does not consume itself, so it just carries on flaming. And Moses says, "Oh my goodness, this is something quite unusual, I must go and look." And then he realises that he is encountering God, he's having a divine encounter. And we see many things here that we will see later in the Bible. So the double calling of Moses, 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 just like later we get Samuel, Samuel. And Moses removes his sandals because in that tradition, as in many other traditions and religions down to today, it's seen that when you enter a holy place, you take your shoes off. He shields his eyes because it was believed that to see God face to face would mean instant death. And here God reveals God's self to Moses. And he does so by naming himself. And he does this in two ways. The first is fairly straightforward. He says, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob," in verse 6. So he's saying, I am the God that your ancestors worshipped, that Abraham and Isaac worshipped. And so far, that's fairly straightforward, because at this time, people had a belief that there were lots of gods. And the Egyptians, if you know anything about Egypt, if you've done it at school or been to a museum, you will know they had a plethora of gods of different things. And so did the Babylonians, and so did the Assyrians, and so did the Canaanites, and everybody had their own gods. And you'd have a god of a region, a god of a particular thing, like the god of water or the god of the harvest. And families would have family gods and household gods. So there was no shortage of deities, no shortage of gods. So far, so good. So we're saying, well, I'm your family god. I'm the god that your father worships. Fair enough. And he says, goes on to say what we know, the story that will come shortly, that will occupy the next 4 books of the Bible, that God will lead his people out of Israel, out of slavery. He will redeem them, and Moses will do this for God. But then later, in verses 13 to 15, one of the most important sections of the Old Testament, God goes further and he reveals his true divine name to Moses. And this name is translated in our English Bibles as I am who I am. And this is a very enigmatic and a very mysterious name. But, and again, it's one of those situations where it would help if we could all read Hebrew. I can't read Hebrew, so I have to rely on other people's comments. But what this is what we would call the divine name Yahweh. Now, very briefly, Hebrew doesn't have vowels, it just has consonants, and you have to sort of guess the vowels that are in the middle, and usually that's relatively straightforward. Now, we think this name is Yahweh, Yahweh, but the name, when it's printed, is only YHWH. And sometimes it's called technically the Tetragrammaton. And this is the unique name for God, for the God of Moses, the God of the Israelites. The Bible uses other names to refer to God. It uses Elohim, which we could just translate as God, and the same word we would find in other religions of this time, El, meaning God, and Adonai, which would mean like Lord or Master. And again, it could be used in a domestic context. A slave could call his master Adonai. But Yahweh is completely unique to the Israelite religion, and here to the God that is revealed to Moses. And this divine name, and we can talk a bit more about this, especially if I haven't explained it very well, is vital because it tells Moses something about, and us, important things about God. First of all, it indicates the nature of it tells us about God's nature. Because in Hebrew, it says, I am who I am. But it also says, because Hebrew doesn't have tenses like we do, past, present and future, so we could also translate it, I was who I was. I will be who I will be. So it's saying that God is eternal. There was never a time when there wasn't God. There never will be a time when there won't be a God. And it's a claim that we come to understand through the Old Testament, that God is unique and all-encompassing, and that the God revealed to Moses is God of all things, of all people, of all times, and that there are no other gods but God, but Yahweh. And this is something that marks out the Israelites from then onwards as a unique people, because they only have one God. And it is something that the Israelites continually struggle with when we read the Old Testament. They continually drift away and try and find other gods to worship as well. But so it tells us that God is unique. But it also tells us, and this is coming back to our topic of God with us, that God desires a personal relationship with his people. God says, I am your God and you will be my people. God reaches out through the burning bush and says, I want you to know me and I want to know you. So it tells us that God is not some sort of divine cosmic force, but God is somehow personal. God wants a personal relationship with his people. And God reaches out. Repeatedly, God reaches out in these pages and says, I want you to know me. I want you to have a relationship with me. I don't want to just sit on a cloud somewhere remote. And we can think about how that relates ultimately to Jesus. And it also indicates, and this passage and others, that somehow, and this is very interesting, we might like to think about this, that God can suffer. Because as we all know, if you start a relationship, you open yourself up to risk and to the risk of being hurt. And repeatedly, especially in the Pentateuch, we find God being upset, God being angry, God despairing of his people. And Moses often has to intercede and say, come on, give them another chance. And we might like to think about what that means, about God with us, we often think about it from our perspective, but what does that mean for God? And so there's a lot more we can say about this and lots more we can unpack. And if I haven't explained myself very clearly, especially about this subject of the divine name, then we can happily come back to that. But I'd just like to reflect as we read that passage and that lovely image of the burning bush and that very powerful image. What does it mean to have God with us? And have we ever had an experience like Moses's? Have we ever had to take a second look at something and realise that it is God trying to tell us something? And I'd like to conclude the introduction here, not with a quote from the Bible so much, but a poem. And this is a very famous poem that was partly inspired partly by this story, the burning bush, and partly by one of the parables, the treasure buried in a field. And it's by the Welsh priest and poet R.S. Thomas, who many of you will know. And it's called The Bright Field. And it's made me reflect more deeply on this story, and it's done so for many others. And it's something we might like to think about too during our study, to see how it helps us understand the story a little bit more, or we could just leave it depending on your view. I'll put a copy of the text of the poem below in the description box. So this is The Bright Field by R.S. Thomas. I have seen the sun break through to illuminate a small field for a while, and gone my way and forgotten it. But that was the pearl of great price, the one field that had the treasure in it. I realise now that I must give all that I have to possess it. Life is not hurrying on to a receding future, nor hankering after an imagined past. It is the turning aside like Moses to the miracle of the lit bush, to a brightness that seemed as transitory as your youth once, but is the eternity that awaits you. Well, I hope that has all given you some food for thought, and I look forward to seeing you on Sunday night. All the details are below, and if you need the Zoom details, just email me going through the website. Take care and see you soon, I hope. Bye-bye.